Welcome to the Hollywood in Toto podcast, the right take on entertainment. The HiT cast offers a weekly look at Hollywood from a conservative point of view. Sick of media bias infecting Hollywood headlines? Tired of stars insulting your views? HiT has your back. Now, here's your host, Christian Toto.
Welcome to episode 43 of the Hollywood in Toto podcast. This week we're speaking with Ian Miles Cheong, a smart, feisty reporter covering pop culture like few others do on the scene. You've read his stories at the Daily Caller and The Sun. But before our chat, I want to talk about two new movies hitting the theaters this month. First up is Battle of the Sexes. The new movie stars Steve Carell and Emma Stone as Bobby Riggs and Billie Jean King, and you know what they did back in 1973. The match for all ages, the Battle of the Sexes itself. We know who won, we know who lost, but this tells a story, kind of the run-up to that epic event. Now, the film is fun at times because the story itself is so darn colorful. You can't help but make an enjoyable film to an extent based on all this material. But the problem here is that the lessons of the film are underlined and highlighted and just in every way exploded so you don't miss a single point. Yes, this was about feminism. Yes, this was about equality. But the script keeps hammering that point over and over and over again. And while there's a lot of fun to be had in the film, it just wears you down. The film is just too woke for its own good. Matter of fact, there are some moments where the real story kind of filters through. In particular, there's a scene or two with Howard Cosell, the late great Howard Cosell. His actual play-by-play commentary is incorporated into the film, and you can just see from some of his comments how the sexism from the early 1970s was alive and well. And that's the way you tell a story, not with the heavy-handed approach that they did here with this particular film. So kudos to the stars. You'll enjoy the film for kind of reliving a part of history, but boy, that woke screenplay really, really hurts. The other film of consequence is coming out now is called American Made. Tom Cruise is the star, so you kind of know what to expect to a certain degree, but this is based oh so loosely on a true story, and a true fellow named Barry Seal, and all the work he did with flying airplanes, taking pictures, potentially for the U.S. government, also working with maybe the DEA, the CIA, and also some drug cartels. What's true? What's fiction? Well, the movie kind of mashes things up pretty regularly, so don't count on much of anything as far as a way of reality here. This is a movie after all, but I think they're playing even looser with the truth than even a typical biopic of this kind. The note here is that the film bashes President Ronald Reagan aggressively, particularly in the last third of the film. So if you're going to go check it out, just know that you'll expect those kind of sequences and that kind of heavy-handed propaganda. But what's most interesting about the movie is something I learned just recently. The Hollywood Reporter reported that as a scene that was included in the original cut that they definitely sliced away. And it showed a young Clinton receiving a lap dance, that's Bill Clinton, mind you, at a strip club in his home state of Arkansas. Now, this is from the Breitbart News, citing the Hollywood Reporter. They said the scene was ultimately cut by the film's producer and financier, Cross Creek Pictures, who didn't want the film to make any political statement. Now, the story also regarding another element of the film that was cut out involving both Clinton and George Bush. So there was sort of more of an even-handed approach to snipping out some politics there. But if you're making a movie and you don't want to get political and yet you include significant Reagan bashing within the context of the story, well, you've just gone political. But of course, that's the way Hollywood works. They don't mind getting political in one direction, but they're less inclined to go in the other direction. So the movie itself, it's entertaining enough. I think Cruise does a great job as usual. The screenplay really lets him down. You don't get a full chance to know who this person is, and more importantly, who his family is. He's married, he's got kids, but that is given so little attention that it really hurts the overall film. So a marginal recommendation for me, but I think the behind the scenes story is fascinating and oh so typical of Hollywood today.
You're listening to the Hollywood in Toto podcast, the right take on entertainment.
This week's hit tip of the week is Jerry Before Seinfeld. It's a new Netflix stand-up special with a twist. Yes, Jerry Seinfeld is on stage telling jokes, but he's also going back over his life, looking at the early days of his career, the early days with him himself, pictures of him as a little baby, getting along with his sisters, his parents. It really kind of peels back the curtain on Jerry Seinfeld, the person, in addition to Jerry Seinfeld, the super successful comedian who made one of the greatest shows of all time, no questions asked. What's interesting about this particular stand-up special is not that it's funny. Of course it's funny. Jerry is always funny. But it's amazing how successful he became and how rich he became and really still has that everyman touch. I think that's remarkable. There are many, many people who become super famous and yet it changes them. And I can't blame them. I mean, to have that fame, to have that fortune, to have all those people at your beck and call, to enter any coffee shop in the country, if not the world, and have people flock to you, how could that not change you to some degree? But listening to his stand-up special today and having heard him over the years, and I saw him back in D.C. maybe a decade or so ago, it's just amazing how he kind of kept that everyman touch. He knows what people go through. He seems to live a very ordinary life despite his mega fame and wealth. So kudos to Jerry Seinfeld for kind of keeping it real, to use a very shop-worn phrase at this point. And it also made me think a little bit about Eddie Murphy, another great stand-up comedian from my youth. I remember listening to his Delirious tape over and over and over again, just brilliant material. What's interesting about Eddie, though, is that he changed over the years. At least he seemed to, as an outsider looking in. He hasn't done stand-up in ages, that's for sure. Why? Maybe he just doesn't want to. It's certainly a grind. But boy, I'd love to hear his voice again, if it's even just a fraction of what he once was. But, maybe the fame changed him, and maybe on some level he understands that the connection he had with the crowd that he had as a younger man may not exist anymore. So it makes the new Jerry Seinfeld special all the better. It's available now on Netflix.
You're listening to my daddy's podcast. He lets me binge Bob's Burgers with him.
Before this week's interview, I wanted to ask a quick favor. Running a website is a challenge. It's a lot of work. And so is crafting a podcast out of your own basement. Now you know where I'm recording this. If you enjoy the HitCast or simply like checking out HollywoodandToto.com, I'd love if you did so whenever it's time to go shopping on Amazon. If you just go to the homepage, HollywoodandToto.com, and find the Amazon ad on the right sidebar, you click on it and just basically shop as usual. Don't have to buy anything, but if you do, that's great. And if you do buy something, a portion of that sale will go to Hollywood and Toto. Now, this is just the same as shopping on Amazon. It's just one extra step. So don't worry about any sort of changes you have to do. It is the simplest thing you can do. Just that one extra moment to get into the site and you are good to go. And that will help support not only the HitCast, but HollywoodandToto.com itself. There were very, very few people holding Hollywood accountable from a right-of-center perspective. It's what I do. It's what I've been doing for the last 18, 20 years, and I hope to keep on doing it with your help. Thanks. Now let's get to my chat with Ian Miles Cheong. Ian's name kept popping up on my Twitter feed over the last few months. Who is this guy writing these really cool stories about Hollywood and pop culture and making these very salient points? Well, I got to know him a little bit on Twitter, and I reached out to him recently for this interview. He writes about political correctness, about the powers that be in Hollywood, about free speech, all the things that really matter in the pop culture landscape these days. He does it from the Daily Caller's perch. He also writes for The Sun and some other publications as well. You can check him out on Twitter at StillGray, Gray. Very feisty, very fun, very informative Twitter feed. I highly recommend it. Here's my interview with Ian Miles Cheong. Well, Ian, first of all, thank you for joining the show. I'm always curious about how people start their careers or how they get to where they are. And I think in your case, particularly, I'm curious because how do you become a right-of-center pop culture critic / reporter? It's not exactly an easy path.
Wow, I mean, I questioned that myself. I used to be in the game industry. I worked in marketing, publishing, and all that stuff. And then I started a gaming website, and then I moved on to a slightly larger gaming website, and then the whole Gamergate thing kicked off, and I was at the time, because everybody in the game industry is, a social justice warrior. So I was really vocal on that side. But at some point, I had kind of an awakening And I've talked about this in other podcasts, so I won't, waste your time with 10 minutes of explanation. But basically, I woke up. I pulled my head out of the social justice Kool-Aid, and then I became more towards the center, towards the right, and then I landed a gig at HiT Street where I wrote about culture. At first, I wrote about video game stuff, entertainment, media, but then I started writing about news, politics in general, basically subjects that I had already been interested in, and stuff that I'd been talking about on Twitter. So that's how I basically got my start.
Excellent. One of the things that I kind of track, I guess more aggressively than other topics, is free speech in our culture, looking at the college situation, talking about artists who are not even speaking up about things like the HBO Confederate scandal. From your perspective, I know you cover a lot of different themes and a lot of different subjects. Is there one particular area where you have the most passion?
I would say video games and the media, whether it's movies, TV, entertainment in general. That's really my realm of expertise, although I do branch out and talk about other things. I also cover tech issues as well as social media. I'm very passionate about these things. I know a lot of people within these scenes, like the YouTube scene in particular. So those are where my passions lie.
When I talk to different actors about Hollywood and being right of center, and some of them say they haven't had issues, a lot of them say they have plenty of issues as far as getting work and facing discrimination. I assume it's just as bad in the tech realm and the gaming realm. You've been in those trenches, or at least near them, for a while. How would you describe their attitude toward people who may be right of center, who may not be that social justice warrior mindset? Is there an issue there? Do they face discrimination? What have you seen and heard?
Oh, well, I was at the exact center of it, to be frank. So I would say that they are, in fact, very hostile towards anyone who's even mildly conservative. If you don't agree with their views, then you are a Nazi sympathizer or a Nazi enabler. They just don't tolerate any sort of dissent. It wasn't always the case. There are, in fact, many game developers who are conservatives and libertarians, but they rarely express their views because they know that in doing so, if let's say they were to criticize feminism, for example, they will be trashed and destroyed by the gaming press, which is largely, I would say, 90%, 95% liberal, or rather progressive liberal. Not just, plain old regular Hillary Clinton style liberal, but like, oh, socialism is good, let's try communism again, stuff like that. It's pretty bad.
If at first you don't succeed. When you talk about sort of the people who get attacked by the social justice crowd, often the best response can be a non-response. I think recently, I think it was Jimmy Fox came under attack for making up some deaf sign language, just as a sort of a goof. And the deaf community kind of came after him, and he really had no response. And of course, the whole imbroglio went away. From your perspective, any sort of advice, or maybe even you've seen stories where people right of center, are successful in fighting back against those cultural forces, or any sort of techniques?
Oh, yes.
Here?
Yeah, I would say double down. Don't just back off away from it unless you work for Microsoft or something. In general, I say double down, because the majority of people who are going to listen to you, who are going to be sympathetic to you, are like the gaming audience, the gamers, are not going to be social justice warriors. The SJWs are a very loud minority. They have a lot of say because people like to signal boost them, and the media likes to do it as well. But if you look at people like Colin Moriarty, or people like Jordan Peterson, or even James Damore, the Google employee who got fired for the so-called anti-diversity memo, they're getting a lot of publicity. And in the case of Peterson and Colin Moriarty, who used to be a games journalist, he used to work at IGN. Nowadays, he's doing his own Patreon, where he produces these history videos, these documentaries. The guy is making $40,000 a month. So I would say keep doing it. PewDiePie, for example, the most popular YouTuber ever, right? He's got, I think, around 60 million subscribers. he is anti-social justice, and he has doubled down on all the nonsense that people are talking about him. He makes fun of these people, and he's more popular than he ever was. People respect him. Wow. People who before used to think that, oh, he's just some gamer who makes funny voices on his videos, now actually go to him for his opinions. And so I would say it hasn't really hurt him at all.
You've been fairly new to the space as far as covering it, writing about it. I do something similar, and I feel like it's changing me in a way. I've become a little more cynical. I feel a little less eager to support certain arts or shows just based on the sort of the rhetoric coming out of the scene. Maybe you're too sort of new to it to kind of really get a feel for it. But you, what's your sense of things? I mean, do you feel like you approach pop culture differently now than you did before you started covering it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I will see developers or writers or creators who, previously I would not care about their politics. But now, if I look into them, I might be turned off by what they produce, because it's very easy to spot when they decide to inject their identity politics into it, like their social justice nonsense. Because, I'll be watching an episode of Blacklist, great show. I watched it for, 5 seasons or something, and then in like the latest season there's randomly stuff about Islamophobia, and I'm thinking, what does this have to do with the storyline at all? This is like some weird subplot that they put in, and it instantly turned me off from wanting to watch more of it. Even though I kept watching it, it made me kind of hesitant about it. So there are instances like that, even in video games. I could be playing a game and having fun with it, and randomly there'll be some bit of dialogue where the writer decided to talk about current political events and, maybe attack Trump or something in it. And I just don't want to experience that, because entertainment, first and foremost, should be a form of escapism. It shouldn't be some political commentary. I mean, if you want to make a political game or movie, that's fine, but I feel deceived because that's not what I went into it for.
Yeah. Well, I think it's the heavy-handed nature is the issue there. Years ago, George Romero did Dawn of the Dead, and he commented on consumerism by having the zombies walk through the mall. That wasn't a heavy-handed statement. That was just, hey, I'm painting a picture. You can kind of draw your own conclusions, but this is what I think about it. And I thought that was actually rather brilliant, even if I don't necessarily agree with it. So this actually segues into a question I wanted to ask you a little bit later, but I think this is a perfect time. I wrote recently at Hollywood and Toto about the one factor that Hollywood experts aren't pointing to as far as the box office goes. And I think in the last 6 months or so, given everything coming out of Hollywood, I think a lot of people like yourself are viewing content differently. And I think for the average moviegoer, there's less impetus to go to the movies to support actors who are not just left of center, but sort of aggressively, angrily so. What are your thoughts? I mean, do you think that are we reaching a point where the product starts to suffer, where people are kind of boycotting and kind of these little micro protests as far as not seeing actors or particular shows or movies?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you look at Lady Ghostbusters 2016, if you want to call it that, that movie was all about political pandering. It's all about identity politics, and I think that turned off a lot of people from the movie. I mean, it's bad enough. The movie itself was bad enough, but I think the whole marketing effort to basically name and shame people who on YouTube were criticizing the trailer for being kind of trashy and calling them out as sexist or misogynist or something, that really turned a lot of people off. And I think that a lot of people would have given the movie a better chance. Let's just say it wasn't as bad as it was. Maybe they would have enjoyed it just a little bit, but because they felt attacked, they didn't want to try it anymore. They didn't want to even watch it. You see it in video games as well. Some game developers like to attack their audience, so they'll say that if you're a Trump supporter, don't buy our game. And as it turns out, people don't buy their game. Gone Home was perhaps one of the most popular games of like 2014 and 2015, and everybody was talking about it. It was this indie, hipster social justice style game. It was made by these hipsters. And their politics, ever since the whole Gamergate thing happened, became very well known. They were very much friends with the people who, were on the progressive or SJW side of the Gamergate thing. And their latest game has come out, and it has sold very few copies because people are distancing themselves from these sorts of games. They know what they're going into now, because before, I think that the gaming audience, or at least the general public, they would look at the game and they would see reviews of it in the press, and the press would be singing their praises, and they'd be like, okay, I'll go buy this game and maybe it's okay. But now, after all of this Gamergate stuff happened, they realize they can't really trust the press. And the only people they can really trust are maybe YouTubers or Twitch streamers who might play the game and actually express their opinions about it and be like, yeah, this is a social justice game. So I think the old media, all these movie reviewers and these TV critics and these game critics, they're all losing their efficacy in influencing the public because they lie to the public, which is, I think, the biggest thing for a lot of people. That there's this loss of trust. Yeah. So I would say, people are being affected by the politics of the people involved in these creations. I mean, if you look at Stranger Things, right? There's David Harbour. He's the main character. He's the sheriff. That guy was on some rant during the Golden Globes about how you should go out and punch all the Nazis. And I have liberal friends. I have many liberal friends, and they told me, they were watching the Golden Globes, and they told me that they feel somewhat less inclined to watch Stranger Things when it comes back in the next season because of what this guy said. They feel like it's sort of... Yeah, it detracts from the whole experience. It's like, okay, you made a good show, but now you're turning it into something political, and you're saying that, we don't want like half of America to go watch the show. Yeah. So, that feels kind of divisive.
Absolutely. Before we move on, you mentioned a game at the beginning, and I think I may have spoken over you. Just for the listeners, what was the game you mentioned that sold well, but the newer version didn't quite sell as many?
Oh, it was Gone Home. It was Gone Home.
Okay.
The newer version was called Tacoma. It's some space walking simulator or something like that. Zero interest. Yeah.
Gotcha. One of the things I'm almost embarrassed to say this because I think it means my cultural reach is limited, but I haven't been subjected to a lot of online hate, a lot of sort of Twitter hate so far, and I think part of this I tend to be a little bit more genteel. I'm not as aggressive as some people right of center, and that's their prerogative. That's perfectly fine. I expect that your experience has not been similar. Can you talk about how you're treated online and what kind of attacks you've received just for kind of being right of center and talking about it?
People like to dredge up, they like to dredge up things that I've perhaps said in the past, and I'm talking like 20 years in the past. When I was like a literal child, they would say, oh, look at him, he said something nasty 20 years ago, therefore he must be a bad person. That's like one of the things I like to bring up. Another thing that they love to argue with me with is like they don't exactly refute the things that I say. Like if I make a point and it's a good one and it goes popular or viral, because pretty much every one of my tweets gets like 500 retweets these days. But because they get upset by what I say and they don't know how to refute it, all they do is reply with like really nasty, offensive insults. They will talk about my appearance. They'll and keep in mind, these people are like social justice warriors, so they shouldn't be talking about a person's ethnicity, race, or appearance, or anything like that. But they'll say, "Oh, you look fat," or "Oh, you look terrible in Tucker Carlson," or "Oh, I bet you're actually a Nazi because the Japs," they'll say the Japanese were like totally Nazis in World War II. Therefore, the idea that an Asian person can't be a Nazi is ridiculous, and it blows my mind when people say things like that, because that's 10 times more offensive than what any Nazi has said to me online, on the internet. Because, like, my great-granddad was an active member of the resistance against the Axis forces here in Asia, and he was tortured to death. And you're telling me that I'm a Nazi because the Japanese people were not, were allied with the Nazis once upon a time. Like, I don't judge the Japanese for fighting with the Axis. Like, none of them had any choice, really. But at the same time, to say that I am a Nazi because the Japanese, or rather other Asian people, were doing this is ridiculous. I mean, what about all the Asians who were oppressed by the Nazis? Do they not count?
Yeah, well, I think it's a sort of a lack of intellectual honesty where the name calling trumps everything else. But that's sadly a sign of the times. One of the things you hear about often from a right-center point of view is conservatives have to get more aggressive in the pop culture space. We have to kind of make more content, have our voices be heard, and clearly that's not happening. Dribs and drabs, that's it. I'm kind of curious, does that still matter? I look back at Trump's victory and I thought, well, all of Hollywood rallied against him and it didn't matter. Like, we ignored their points of view. Is there sort of a cultural change going on, or does it still matter from a content point of view and not so much a sort of a hectoring, lecturing point of view?
I think it matters from a content point of view. The reason, a lot of lefty stuff, like, say, comics are a very good example of this. Like, comic books are not popular anymore. People have stopped reading them. And the biggest reason for this is because of the social justice push in comic books. The social justice push is, it exists within video games, it exists within movies and TV, but the people running the show and, the executives, all they care about is the bottom line. They don't really care about the social justice stuff. They just want to make money, right? So while there is an underlying push for social justice in these scenes, it's very muted. But it's getting louder and louder, and that's a problem because at one point, we're going to reach a point where we are unable to consume anything without a social justice message in it. And comic books are a very good example of that. It's impossible to read a comic these days, like whether it's from, especially Marvel, I should say, because DC still has some holdovers. But in Marvel, every single one of the leading comics are impossible to parse without some heavy-handed social justice message. And so people read it, and they will get turned off, and they stop subscribing, and that's why they stop printing them. They cancel those lines. So I think there is room here for, if maybe not necessarily a conservative, brand, but something that's apolitical or something centrist, something that's, escapist. Like, if people don't want that heavy-handed lecture when they read a comic book about heroes and bad guys or whatever. They just want to have a good time, and I think that's a big problem with content, or rather media, that tries to push narratives into people, because people have their existing stuff going on for them. I already have my beliefs. I don't need you telling me I'm a bad person just because I disagree with you.
Yeah. When you think about sort of the social justice warriors and also things like the clampdown on free speech, I think they're all connected, and I think that the culture is shifting. And I was kind of curious, my last question to you would be, do you see positive trends? Are you hopeful that the work that you do and other like-minded folks are making an impact, or do you think that we've got to kind of hit bottom before things get better?
I think we just, we got to keep fighting, but it's still getting worse and worse, because the more we speak up, the more they try to silence us. And it's no more evident than it is on YouTube, where they are actively censoring anyone who's right of center, or even left of center, because the far left at this point, it's become a left pole, as Steven Pinker would like to say. It's the mythical spot from which every other direction is right. So a lot of people are being censored. Anyone who speaks out against political correctness, against this whole push for gender fluidity in the media, or how all white people are racist, all these nonsense views are being silenced. And I think it's going to get worse before it has to get better, because right now the left, I would say the progressive left, has a monopoly on all these platforms, and at some point it's got to give, because they will go too far in trying to censor people. And that's when the point, that's what needs to happen before the right rises up and says, hey, here's an alternative. It's about free speech. And, that's when I think the left will have to pull itself back to the center.
Yeah, a good point. And I've noticed in recent years that people like Amy Schumer and Tina Fey, who used to be immune to the critics from that perspective, are now being targeted, even like a Will Ferrell, who is as left of center as they come. When his Get Hard movie came out, he was basically called a racist for making that movie. So it is interesting. Before I let you go, Ian, we ask all our guests at the Hollywood in Toto podcast, what are you watching these days? What are you reading? What's on your iPod? What are some maybe content recommendations you can share that maybe aren't so obvious, but you're enjoying them all the same?
Oh, absolutely. Right now, I listen to an ongoing podcast. It's called Hardcore History. It's by Dan Carlin. Definitely recommend it. Dan Carlin manages to weave a very interesting retelling of history. Like, history is dry. It's kind of boring to read up on. But he actually tells a story. He weaves a narrative from various perspectives. Like, he can talk about a single event in the rise of Genghis Khan, and he can tell it from 5 different perspectives. From the perspective of the Khans, the Christians who were being invaded, the Muslims who were being invaded, and maybe the Chinese people who were living there in these locations. And that alone will be a single episode. So it's very fascinating. So if you're into history and you want to learn about Genghis Khan or World War I or the Romans or something, I definitely recommend that.
Excellent.
In terms of movies or TV shows, I just watch Netflix and see whatever's on. Right now I'm watching a fun science fiction show. It's called Killjoys. It's if you're a fan of Firefly, I think you'd like that one.
Good pick. I've been Ozarking myself, so I'll have to check out that when I get a chance once I wrap up the season. Well, thank you, Ian Miles Cheong. Thank you so much for checking us out. I've been enjoying your work for a while, so it's kind of a treat to have you on the show. Your work can be found at the Daily Caller and the Sun, and of course, you used to be a contributor to HiT Street. Sad to see that particular website go, but you can keep checking out Ian at those different outlets. Ian, thanks a lot, and we will check in with you down the road.
You're welcome.
Well, thanks again for listening. Don't forget to check out HollywoodandToto.com for both the show notes and, of course, the latest entertainment news. Please follow me at Twitter at HollywoodandToto. And we'd love it if you leave a podcast review over at iTunes. See you next week.